one thing we did learn is that if you have a companion with you who is not used to somebody even with a very short train, and this is a very reasonable short train, not a huge awkward train, it's not a fashion plate train, it's just a perfectly reasonable train. But if your companion is not used to walking with someone who has a train, make them walk in front of you.
Yeah, no, my husband has to walk in front of me, or he can hold my arm, but he has to be in front of the dress. Our first hour we were married, he stepped on my little tiny train on my wedding gown and ripped the bustling right out. And our wedding planner had to come in with a safety pin and rebustle my skirt. So yes, always, if your companion's not used to people with big skirts, they have to walk in front of you. Maybe that's part of why the 5 paces behind thing. It's like, just get back off. You're gonna mess up this hymn.
The other thing is, like, I remember I was texting Lisa about this because I was actually pretty anxious about wearing even just a very small train, because I was a little bit worried that it was going to get dirty. And you know, and there are various ways you can deal with that. If you're really worried about it, you can add basically like hand based on like an inner facing that you're then later either going to take off and wash, or I guess replace. In the end,
a dust ruffle. Yeah,
a dust ruffle. In the end, I decided that, well, I didn't really have time to do anything else because I was out of time.
But you would have been like stapling it on, yeah.
So I also decided, so I've done this before when I had jeans that were too long, and sometimes they're just too long to where you think to yourself, do I need to do anything about it? And so my policy has always been, if I do step on them or mess them up enough, or they, I guess, drag on the ground enough that they get destroyed, then at that point, that's when I deal with it. I can either hem it then or do something about it then. So I decided to just leave it. And actually, I think I learned this a little bit, and this wasn't intentional, but when we wore those kirtles, and even like it was crappy, it was like raining, and like we were over the kind of dirty pavement, and it was we got home and you were actually so surprised that the hems were still really clean. So I think, especially if something isn't like super heavy or like getting ground into the dirt, I mean, I wouldn't like drag it through mud on purpose, but I think
but it kind of, the fabric doesn't, you know, mentally, yeah, you're right. You kind of think like, oh, this is gonna get, because you're used to the idea that, yeah, you're wearing like denim jeans with like a heavy hem. Mm-hmm. And you think about how your jeans get messed up if they're too low. Again, we're showing our age because that was a fashion when we were, you know, in our late teens, to have your jeans be pretty long and kind of boot cut, so they were flapping around a little bit. And when you're a short girl, your jeans end up in the mud, or walking. The worst thing was walking through a rainstorm. Mm-hmm. Because then the hem of your jeans would pick up the water and kind of suck it up to you, and you'd get wet to the knees. So that was gross, and of course it doesn't dry because its denim is so tightly woven. So I think we were both thinking of that, was we're wearing these silk kirtles with like padded, you know, the hems on those kirtles have a couple of layers of silk taffeta and at least one layer of wool flannel in them. They're padded hems, which gives the skirt this wonderful drape. But I was like, oh, this is going to be such a pain to get this mud out of it. And then I think one of them even has like some wool tape along the edge. And I was like, oh, this is going to be a pain, because it was raining cats and dogs. We were walking through the streets of Philadelphia. Yeah. And it was fine. I just had to dry them out a little bit. They were fine. And I was stained. So
long story short, my very small train did not.
Long story short, don't be afraid to wear a long skirt, just because you were traumatized by your blue jeans in the 90s.
Exactly.
Don't behave the same.
So it's that kind of detail that makes you think like, okay, like these are the things that people didn't worry about. And of course, I got the question that everybody always gets when they're wearing historical clothing in public, which is like, aren't you hot?
Aren't you hot? Yeah. Well, it's like, well, it's hot.
Also, where
hot anyway. Yeah.
But aren't you hot? Well, and my neighbor said it first, and some other women said it to me later. And I was like, well, okay, like it's a hot day. I'm going to be hot no matter what I wear. But then outside of the context, I think that for most people alive today, like, I don't know if they were even necessarily thinking about the corset, or they were just thinking about the fact that I was clearly wearing multiple layers of clothes, and like, this is not the lightest blouse fabric ever. But I think for me, like, the comparison would be if I was wearing like a business suit with pantyhose.
Yeah, you'd be hot.
I would have
Yeah.
been significantly more uncomfortable. I wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't sweating.
So I think there's a couple, I think when we talk about being comfortable in historic clothes, there's a couple of things that are happening. So one thing, and we're going off script, that's fine. We finished everything we wanted to cover. So there's a couple of things. One thing is
talk about blood quantum.
Well, we'll talk about blood quantum at the very end, but yeah, well, or let me talk about that right now, and then we can. So these are, it's myth busting. This is our myth busting segment. So we realized when we brought up that Polly had Scottish ancestry, that some people would almost certainly ask us, either in the comments or in real life, well, then how much Cherokee was she? And the answer is 100%, because it's a binary. Gender isn't binary, but being Cherokee is. Is what I like to say. So her nationality, no matter what, was Cherokee. And it's so interesting because so many people, even well-meaning, caring people, will ask, what was her blood quantum? They don't know blood quantum, but they'll ask, what percent was she? As if that's a legitimate, reasonable question. I always like to point out that's an incredibly American imperialist assumption that even for that era wasn't a concept. So the idea of blood quantum, of being able to take a chart and a literal pedigree and figure out somebody's percentage Indian, wasn't even really delineated in the United States until about 1929, 1930s. Interestingly, the certificate degree of Indian blood that you do get when you enroll as a modern Native person in your tribe, we actually don't know exactly when that started being done, because the records for it were destroyed deliberately by activists in the 1960s. So probably about 1930, 1935 was the first time that blood quantum was kind of codified. When you look at Dawes-Roll's records, they were calculating a blood quantum equivalent. They didn't call it that. But it was equivalent, and it's expressed in fractions. So 1/1, 1/2, all the way down. I've seen blood quantum. I've seen Indian degree of Indian blood columns as low as 1/64, and so they were clearly as early as 1901 calculating and documenting that. But when we look in the 19th century records, the main distinction at the time tended to be, were you full blood? Were you mixed blood? Were you white? And those were perceived to be the three main boxes. So we don't know whether Polly perceived herself to be mixed blood. She definitely has ancestries from multiple places, but her citizenship is undoubtedly Cherokee, and that's actually part of what caused the problems to happen later, was that she was a Cherokee citizen. Her, to be fair, at the time, perceived by everybody, white husband was also a Cherokee citizen. So there's some nuances there. So the bottom line is, asking about Polly's blood quantum is definitely a historical, at the most, if she thought about herself in a racialized way, which was still not very well defined in America at the time, or in, among the dependent nations of the time. She probably perceived herself to be mixed race. But this is also in a community, and we'll get into this more when we talk about the 1840s, where being mixed race wasn't remarkable anymore. And it hadn't been for a long time, for at least 3 generations. So when everybody's last pure blood person was their great grandparent, it's not a remarkable element to your life. And it was way more important to the white people trying to count us as to who counted as a pure blood Indian, because again, they were relying on that definition of whiteness as being very special and different than other people. they were relying on, and they had their own cultural assumptions about what that meant. Interestingly, I just found a really cool chart, cool to me now. I didn't notice it the first time I read the book, where they did a census in the 1830s of Cherokees, and were clearly looking or assuming there would be differences between mixed race and pure blood families. And the numbers that they recorded themselves showed no real difference, at least by the metrics they chose. So we can get more into that later. But bottom line, Polly didn't have a blood quantum because she died before they started doing blood quantum calculations. And also asking us our blood quantum is also not appropriate because, again, our citizenship is that we are Cherokee Americans. We're both at the same time. And it does lead to the question of, well, what do you think she looked like? How do you know? Are you Cherokee enough to represent Polly? And the answer is none of your business, but also yes. The answer is that's not for you to decide. It's for us to decide. And we're not only her direct descendants, but plausibly looking at the panoply of how Cherokee people look, there's no monolithic what Cherokees look like. We look very Cherokee if you know what Cherokee people actually look like. And if that bothers you or concerns you, I can give you some reading that might help you integrate that idea into your thinking, because it's a very inappropriate way to try to codify Indianness by skin tone. It's not appropriate, especially Cherokee-ness is not appropriate to look at skin tone and think that we don't look Cherokee because you have a perception that we should look past some kind of test of color, because Cherokee isn't a color. So there's my little soapbox about that. And then what else was I going to talk about? I was getting off on another tangent.
I think the last thing was the debates on the boundaries of how some people use that as an excuse to ignore the 1866 treaty.
Yes. So one of the problems is that we did have a treaty in 1866 in which we specifically gave citizenship and the rights of citizenship to the freedmen who had essentially survived being enslaved by Cherokees. And unfortunately, one of the frustrating things about colorism and about the assumptions that Cherokees should look a certain way, and that we don't look too much one way or the other, right? So there's an assumption that we should be somewhere in the middle of kind of the human color spectrum. And really dark Cherokees don't seem authentic to people, and really light Cherokees don't seem authentic to people, but we're equally authentic. And one of the struggles that we've had as a nation in the last couple of decades has been in fully embracing that community, partly because of our own internalized colorism. And also sometimes our excuse will be, well, if we have these people in our community who are Cherokee citizens who don't have any Cherokee ancestry, then the Americans can say we're not a legitimate tribe and they can disband us. Well, guess what? American colonialism can do whatever it wants to us anyway.
Yeah, they're gonna try that no matter what. So.
And interestingly, by properly, and I feel very emboldened to speak about this because also I feel like the current government of the nation has been really good about it, has made really great strides. I'm not embarrassed the way I was about 15 years ago to talk about this, because I feel like we're making good strides towards true inclusiveness of our freedmen descended family members. I think we already linked to some really good material about that, but we can bring that up. But the important element there is that that actually emphasizes that Cherokee-ness still behaves as a citizenship and a versus an ethnicity, because we were being treated as a domestic dependent nation by signing that treaty in 1866. We were also treating ourselves as being equivalent to either a state or another country versus an ethnicity. No one else could have signed a treaty like that and had it make sense if you weren't. So like the state of Alabama, the state of Mississippi, they had to sign that kind of treaty as a government, but their individual communities didn't. And so it actually bolsters our perception of ourselves as a domestic dependent nation when we acknowledge and fully embrace our freedmen descended family members, because that's treating us like a government, which is what we are. So that's kind of my soapbox about that. And I feel like I was going to go off on another tangent, but we can stop there.
I think we're at like an hour and a half.
We're at an hour and a half, and we got plenty of material.
Probably enough.
We can talk about, there's other stuff to talk about, but yeah, so people yearn, Americans tend to yearn quite innocently, I'm not saying they're being mean, for an idea that there's a racialized definition that you can define us by percentages. And the bottom line is you can't, and especially for Polly's era, it's not only not really possible, it's not historically appropriate, because she wouldn't have had that kind of thinking. That's like taking modern thinking and applying it to her. So yes, we are certainly Cherokee enough to talk about our ancestor, and she's our ancestor. And what did she look like? We don't know.
Yeah.
So, we're doing our best with what we've got. And the bodies we have to work with, the models we have available are us. And to be fair, by most like when you look at her granddaughter's photograph, which is what the earliest photograph we have of someone from that line, I see a lot of similar features, both in our body type, like the heights of various parts of our bodies, and our faces. Like, we're not, like, plausibly Polly might have actually looked like us, like literally. So challenge your ideas about what it means to be an Indian, and that it's not technically a race. And if that makes you really uncomfortable, and in my life I've only had white people be really distressed by it. If it makes you distressed, I can, I'm happy to help you try to work through that. But that's the way it is. That's what I've got.